I'll have to adjust. Sure. Is it switched to this? Okay, 3. Yes, okay. Work now. Yes. Hello. Hello. Yes. Can you also check that? Can you check that the signal is coming on the webcast? One, 2, 3. Sri Aurobindo has been describing the development of religion as one of the first of nature's methods to prepare humanity for a deeper inner life. But they come into their own as evolution proceeds. But in describing the stages of religious emergence, we see them match the stages of human consciousness developing. Stage 1 is when the consciousness is largely instinctive, vital, driven by life impulses, sensing with the vital sensitivity very similar to the animals, but through that opening to the unknown and infinite. In the second stage, there is the emergence of the mind. And mind now creates a struggle. It tries to rationalize what was sensed. But reason cannot sense as the vital can. And so there is a conflict. Reason builds a superstructure, often suffocating the early instincts. But it also tries to organize, give form, structure, and so on. The third stage, though, is when the impulse in nature is to liberate the secret spiritual experience and knowledge and spread it out universally. And at that point, we find this double movement of expansion and contraction, concentration. Expansion, which spreads that which has been developed, in the process losing what has been developed, diluting, mixing, even distorting, misusing even, especially the occult side of the knowledge that comes. At the same time, the necessity for the expansion is there because the spiritual urge of nature is to make this as wide as possible. Concentrated focal point is where the breakthrough takes place. The widening is where something of it spreads out, even though at great loss. In the next paragraph, which we read last time, he discusses how there is a division that takes place in the process of something that wants to retain the purity and something else that wants now to give forms which are more acceptable. But before we re-enter that part of the discussion, there are some examples which I wanted to bring for our study of how this dilution or this spreading out can take place, even though there is dilution, and especially in the context of the life here in the ashram. And since we are still in the midst of two great darshans, to put it in the context of the darshan itself, the mother was asked this question in one of the classes. The child asks, "Mother, why does one feel a different atmosphere on darshan days? What should one do on those days?" And so mother replies, "Different? You ask this question? There is an invasion of more or less dark and foreign elements who may come with goodwill, possibly, but who come with an almost total ignorance and throw it all out in the atmosphere. And so naturally, if one is a little bit open to what is happening, one feels crushed under the weight of this increased ignorance. I don't mean that there is no ignorance here, but still the dose is different. Here, for all that, there is a sort of manipulation of the consciousness going on constantly, night and day, visibly and invisibly. And whether one wants it or not, in spite of everything, one takes it in. And after some time, it acts. So she's describing the normal phase of life here before the invasion happens. When a few people come, something changes, but it is not so much as to give a painful feeling. But when it is a rush like this, dashing in all at once, then the whole level comes down immediately. And unless one is able to withdraw into oneself and keep one's head above these submerging waters, this swamping flood of ignorance, if one can't raise one's head above it, well, one feels very uneasy. And so the child now reacts, "No, mother, it is an atmosphere of joy." And mother, "You find it an atmosphere of joy?" "Yes, mother." "Then it is personal, my child. It is something purely personal, and you ought to be able to keep it. It comes because at this time there are memories awakening in you, a certain concentration. Or perhaps what you call joy is a vital pleasure, no? Isn't it a sort of excitement? What do you feel? When do you feel this joy?" So the child says, "Today it was after darshan." "Mother, I think it is the same thing that happens to people who are more receptive on their birthdays or who need to remember an event to awaken their receptivity." Think about this. It's a very interesting suggestion, isn't it? What about the other days? So you need an event to remember. It's New Year's Day. Oh, plan for what I will do this year. I need to receive special blessings. But I make a special concentration because there's an event to remind, to awaken their receptivity. And she continues, in the days when Sri Aurobindo used to give darshan, before he gave it, there was always a concentration of certain verses or of a certain realization which he wanted to give to people. And so, each darshan marked a stage forward. Each time something was added. But that was at a time when the number of visitors was very limited. It was organized in another way, and it was part of the necessary preparation. So, in preparation for the darshan, you would have a special meditation that the mother would have often on the evening before to prepare you for the actual darshan in which this special concentration was given. So now she says, but this very interesting. Many people come thinking that, oh, it's darshan, so receive on other occasions, which may not be necessarily darshan, she says. And it occurs much more often on other kinds of occasions in other circumstances. She doesn't specify what, but if we try to feel, it's easy to catch some of those could be. The movement is much accelerated. The march forward, the stages succeed each other much more rapidly. And perhaps it is more difficult to follow. Or in any case, if one doesn't take care to keep up, it's difficult to keep up. Now that's another suggestion she has. So it's difficult to follow, to notice the change taking place, but to keep up with the change. That means the pressure of the change in the consciousness is taking place, and if we can't keep up, there's a gap and it produces an internal crisis, even sometimes an internal illness. So I'm not reading, I'm just making as an observation, the struggle to keep. So she continues. One is much more quickly outdistanced than before. One gets the feeling of being late or of being abandoned. Things change quickly. Interesting. Whenever you have the sense that I'm late or I'm abandoned, something is happening and I'm not a part of it, or it has passed me by, or in dream state it takes on the form that you see the train leaving and you have not packed your bags, or you have not bought the ticket, or there's an exam taking place and you have not prepared for it. Something representing that gap of preparation, of not being ready. I remember many times it would happen to me that I would look at the date and I said, oh, it's already the week of the darshan, but I feel as if I'm still in January. The February darshan week has begun, but I feel as if I'm still living in January and I have to keep up, somehow pull back. But it's a very concrete feeling. So why am I reading this? Not only because it's the darshan context, but now he explains what happens, how this dilution or mixture is used for the work. And she says, and I ought to say that these darshan times, with all this rush of people, serve not so much for an inner progress, that is to say, inside the ashram, as for a diffusion outside. I see the focus of the inner gathering is done at other times, but at the time when the maximum rush of people come, the focus is on the diffusion. And so this she explains. The use we make of these days is a little different. We here represent Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. The use we make of these days is a little different. Above all, it is to go farther, have a vaster field, reach more distant points. But the concentration is less, and there is this inconvenience of a large crowd, which was always there, but which has been much greater during these last years than at the beginning. And she's saying this in which year? 1956. So from 56, you can see how much the numbers have increased, how much dilution has grown, and so on. And then there is the other dilution, which is of the tourism, very different interests, and often coming with very different objectives. So then she continues. At the beginning, there's been much greater during these last years than at the beginning. At the beginning, there was not such a crowd, and perhaps the quality of the crowd was also a little different. And it's again something to think about. When we come for the darshan, what do we bring? But also, what do we seek? What do we aspire for? And you can, of course, ask for, and you have a right to ask for, I want more money, I want more blessings for my success, for my well-being, for my health, and all that, and it's all legitimate. But there is something else that one could do. I come to give myself to the divine. Not what I want to take, but I want to give. And to give yourself wholly. And it changes the whole thing. It changes also the atmosphere. Because when people come to take, there is always this sense of sucking and drawing. When you come to give yourself, there is as if a fire which is being gathered, and all the little sparks gather to intensify the fire. So, Mother continues. So, the joy you were speaking about would rather be a kind of excitement or the feeling of a more intense or more active life. But it is not actually a greater presence. One puts oneself perhaps into a more receptive state in which one receives more, but there is no intensification of the presence. Not to my knowledge, she says. I remember as children, we were in the school, and on the darshan occasion, we would special dress, you wore a special badge, and it was all white, and then you went and stood, and you were given an important responsibility and place. And so the children who were volunteers would be looking forward to this, and the others would be looking forward to, wow, all this is going to be happening. It was not as suffocating as now, so you could still move around, run around in the space, but some special event. So, not to my knowledge, she says. So it must be within you that you have to find the reason and the remedy for keeping this joy. Someone asks, but Mother, what is the significance of the message you give every darshan? For example, today you gave the picture of the flower that symbolizes the supramental manifestation. 1956, obviously. What is the exact date? Let me see if we can. This was on August 15th, 1956. So Mother replies, yes, as I have just told you, this is spread in thousands of copies all over the world. Now consider the message being printed and distributed all over the world. It is an externalization of the thing. It is a way of spreading the influence, spreading the message, reaching farther. Everything that is said in a darshan message has been studied, proved, tested beforehand. And on darshan day, it is given. Again, she explains. First, the experiment is made. Then it is declared publicly. The first movement is the individual development. At the darshan time, it is spread abroad. Now you see here this double movement, which was very much a part of the ashram life, and especially around this, let's say, ceremony, celebration, or even ritual. And you see how the concentrated time, which would be lost otherwise, is used for the movement of diffusion. So she's speaking of how physically there is this spreading out of the message. It is an externalization of the thing. It is a way of spreading the influence, spreading the message, reaching farther. Now again, if you have to pause, because the Mother also never uses words unnecessarily. So she's several ideas here, spreading the influence, spreading the message, reaching farther. And there are different things. Card, printed paper, was infused with the spiritual force before being sent. So it was a routine at that time that all the messages printed would be brought to the Mother for her to concentrate and infuse the force into them. Then they would be taken to be distributed. Well, she gave them generally on her own, but later through others. Or they were sent by post afterwards, after the darshan had taken place. So it was filled with the force, and the cards would go. They would reach a person, and the postman would bring the card, and the person would feel the difference. I remember it happened here, one of the disciples of the ashram who was living in a garden near Jipner, top garden. He described how suddenly he felt this great delight filling, and then the postman came with some publication which had just reached him. And he could recognize that influence, that thing which came, and many such stories. You receive, you hold the paper, and you can still feel the force. If you have ever had the occasion of touching an object or a book which the mother has blessed or given or signed, if it has not been handled by too many people, you can feel in the book still the force, the light which has been put into it. So, this is the first thing she's referring to, the influence aspect. With the physical object going, there is actually an influence of the force and the work to be done by that force which is going out all over the world. And remember, what is being put out is something which has already been realized. It has been built up here and now is put out for spreading. The second thing which is there is spreading the message. So there's a message which is written in the card. And if you see in the mother's agenda, often you will find a conversation with Satprem where she's telling him, oh, I have prepared such and such a message for the darshan. And then she explains how the message came, how she formulated, and in the wording she says, oh, if I use this word, people would understand like that, so I use it in that word. And then she says, but it's still incomplete, there's this element missing. And then she gives the full form to it, and she says, so that's how I've selected this message. And on the new year, it would often be a message which would represent the thing to be done for that year, the aim, the realization which is intended for that year, or so on for the darshan messages. And the third thing she uses is reaching farther. So there's an influence already there, there's a message already gone, but going farther than what is currently possible or available. And for that, the mass of people coming and the impulse of diffusion that takes place through the messages and through the people is used for this purpose, going farther each time, a little more and a little more, as if penetrating into the consciousness of humanity. But then we see this very interesting thing. Everything that is said in a darshan message has been studied, proved, tested beforehand. And look at these three words, studied. There's a problem in humanity, a problem to be solved, a problem of human nature, a problem of evolution, a problem of integration of some possibility with a receptive or lack of receptivity. A problem which has been studied, and then the solution worked out until it is proved and then tested in several people. And all this is happening in the ashram, in the community here, and perhaps occasionally people coming in and out. And once it has been tested, and testing always involves the fine-tuning to make it perfect, she says, beforehand, well before the darshan, before the diffusion. And on darshan day, it is given. So the power of given is this. Something which has been studied, proved, and tested beforehand, when it is given, it changes, it transforms, it realizes whatever it is that is intended. So the act of being given is the act of fixing it in humanity and spreading it out. First, the experiment is made, then it is declared publicly. The first movement is the individual development. At the darshan time, it is spread abroad. She continues, Sri Aurobindo always spoke of two movements, the formation of the individual in order to be able to reach the goal individually, and the preparation of the world. For the progress of the individual is, so to say, not exactly delayed or helped by the condition of the whole, but this brings about a certain balance between the two. So if you don't expand it to the world, it drags and does not help, does not support, does not nurture the individual to proceed. The individual movement is always much more rapid and more penetrating. It goes farther, more deeply, and more quickly. The collective movement forms a sort of basis which both restrains and supports at the same time. Interesting. So when an individual is making this very rapid, penetrating forward progress, What is the support that is being given to him? It's the current state of his immediate surrounding society. That's the support. That's the base from which you can leap. Well, that's the base from which you can try to fall, but the support pulls you up. But it's the base on which you can push back to leap forward. But at the moment, now this which you're supporting becomes also a drag because you move too fast. So at the same time, it serves two purposes. It prevents you from falling, and in that sense, it supports. But it prevents you from going forward too rapidly. In that sense, it pulls you back. So every time there have been sufficiently a few individuals who have moved forward and the thing is fixed and now spread out, in the collective there is this forward movement a little bit more, which allows now a greater leap and so on. So the collective movement forms a sort of basis which both restrains and supports at the same time. And it is a balance between these two movements which is necessary. So, the more rapidly one goes individually, the more necessary it is to try to extend and strengthen the collective basis. Now, this is a very important insight, guidance, or even solution to the problem. Because increasingly we face this kind of difficulty. And a lot of people today are complaining, oh, things were so much easier before, now there is so much dilution, so much loss, so much confusion. Yes, but why? Because we did not take the trouble to spread and stabilize in the collective that which we had got. We were too busy or too happy remaining in our individual contained experience or realization. And when suddenly there is this shift in the collective, you are as if pulled down, or the realization suddenly begins to feel unstable, not so sure anymore, you realize, oh, instead of blaming others, you realize you have not fulfilled your role in participating in this. What she calls, the more rapidly one goes individually, the more necessary it is to try to extend and strengthen the collective basis. To try to, you may not succeed, but the very fact that you attempt, and it may not go all the way to the rest of the world, but you're in your immediate environment, which is given to you as your space, your family, your friends, your circle, your community, whatever form it may be. That little bit is necessary to extend and strengthen the collective basis. And you will see every time the people who are the most sensitive are the ones most complaining, but they are the ones who are the most negligent of this aspect of the responsibility. I put it to myself in another way some 10 years ago. Suddenly I said, my God, with this kind of decline taking place in society, when I come back in my next incarnation, I won't get any of this good stuff which I got in this incarnation in my early childhood. That quality is gone. You don't find it anywhere. And I said to myself, at least from a very selfish perspective, I must try to ensure that at least something is created, that this content is held and protected in a few, so that when I come back, I can come to those few and say, help me learn. You can think of it in a very selfish way, but it comes to the same thing finally. What effort do we make for this to extend, to expand, and stabilize in the community? And it does not mean you have to go all the way to the world. What you see, in fact, in the world is, let's say, there is a huge mass which may be very, very mixed and dulled and not at all what we would want. And then there is a smaller gathering focus of people who have some sensitivity, some higher turn, may not be a fully spiritual turn. And out of that, there is a gathering of those who have a still deeper spiritual opening or aspiration, but not necessarily a full dedication. And out of that, there's a gathering of those who have a dedication, but it is, as we call, a part-time dedication. We are part-time sadhaks. We do our effort 20 minutes every day. And then within that, there is a smaller group which is much more dedicated, but not always the same intensity, which fluctuating intensity, but some kind of sustained effort, and so on. But every time that you have around you some group that is in your immediate influence, that effort is necessary to form a collective, let's say, basis in which we end up helping each other. among friends who share a similar aspiration. Just the fact that we meet, just the fact that we connect, just the fact that we cherish this shared aspiration is enough to form that basis and to support and nourish each other. Sometimes we don't have to meet every day, we don't have to say anything, but the fact that we are in touch. Sometimes we may even be at a physical distance, but there that we are in contact, that in our thoughts, in our feelings, we cherish these friendships, these connections, these shared aspirations. That also forms like a collective on a subtler level, which is as vivid, as supportive as a physical space, even. And then, of course, it extends to the sub collectivities within the collectivity. You may have a subgroup within your community in Auroville or within the ashram, or extending eventually to the larger collectivity and so on. So, the more rapidly one goes individually, the more necessary it is to try to extend and strengthen the collective basis. The other questions which follow, someone asks what is important about 15th of August, and Mother says 15th is Sri Aurobindo's birthday. It is a capital importance in the life of the earth from the physical point of view. So, and then someone says, oh, but other important events took place, became free, etc. And Mother says, what? The liberation of India. Is it because the liberation of India came about on 15th of August? And so it is necessary to tell you why it happened. You can't find it out for yourself, can you? It needs to be said, does it? I think Sri Aurobindo has written it also. And she says, yes, it is exactly that. Today, there came into my hands one of those greeting cards which people send on puja days or for the new year or other such festivals. And on this card was written something like this. I don't recall the exact words, but anyway, they were greetings on the occasion of this memorable day of the birth of our nation. It is sent by someone who I think proclaimed himself a disciple of Sri Aurobindo quite a long time ago, Mother says. That seemed to me one of those enormities which human stupidity alone can commit. And then she says, what's the correction? She says, if he had said, on this memorable day of the birth of Sri Aurobindo and its natural consequence, the birth of the nation, it would have been quite all right. But still, the important point was left out, and the other mentioned, which is quite simply a consequence, a natural result. It had to be like that. It could not be otherwise, Mother says. But people always think like that, the wrong way up, always. They take the effect for the cause, they glorify the effect and forget the cause. And that is why the world walks on its head with its feet in the air. It's a very vivid, very powerful, but also very shocking statement. And that is why the world walks on its head with its feet in the air. Quite simply, there is no other reason. So then she takes up other questions, and we don't get into that now. It's something very important. Many important things are described there, but about the divine grace being all powerful, but that it has to act in a certain way. Otherwise, we think that the grace is not all powerful. And she takes up that whole question and addresses it in great detail, but we won't go into that. But it was this aspect of the concentration and expansion which I wanted to highlight. This also, you can see, while it happens on the darshan occasion, that they used it for the expansion of the influence, it does not mean it was only on that day. There were many sub-events. Somebody has just come from somewhere for a special request to meet the mother, and it would be a point of link for that space that the person represents. And mother would act on that space. And the person was as if a representative of that country or of that community or that movement. And there would be this expansion. So what we see is a big picture in which many small movements of concentration expansion taking place, and then that whole thing taking place in a larger cycle of concentration and expansion, which takes place many such in a still larger cycle of concentration and expansion. And we can say today the bulk of it is much more about expansion having gone too far, far enough to have lost the point of concentration. If we look at an institution such as the Sri Aurobindo Society, which, with 280 centers all over India, the centers which were at one point thriving centers have pretty much mostly lost that focus. They've just become institutional spaces where nothing much happens because the generation of people that grew up and built it have passed on, and the young generation has not really taken that light. And we would blame it on the insufficiency of the concentration in those centers, or in this center of which those centers are as if special expansions. And so when that expansion goes too far and there is the dilution of the whole experience itself, the call for the concentrated experience is again there, and it demands, otherwise you lose everything as if. And that's what we see today everywhere. When people feel this restlessness, oh, I'm missing something, it's no more what it used to be. Rather than blaming others, ask yourself, what are you doing to bring it back to that intensity of concentration? The mother will do her part, but what are you doing on your part to receive, to hold, to contain, so that she can build in you and in the collectivity? And at least for those of us who feel called to participate in this movement of the concentration and consolidation, we have to start making that effort without worry for the dilution that takes place. Okay, that was one cycle. It has reached its end. Now the second rhythm, the next cycle begins. Let's do our part in it. So this was one thing I wanted to read out. And then there was a second one, which was a slightly different context, but the same idea that mother gives. But she puts this now in the context of a much larger development of humanity. Literally going across a cycle, it moves down and spreads into the mass of humanity through the rest of the three yugas, until at some point it's as if the whole thing is lost, and again a new cycle of that ascent. So mother is referring to a previous phase of that cycle, and I'll read from that. It is a pretty longish text, but she says, with regard to the evolution upwards, it is more correct to speak of the psychic presence than the psychic being. For the psychic presence which little by little becomes the psychic being. For it is the psychic presence which little by little becomes the psychic being. In each evolving form, there is this presence, but it is not individualized. It is something which is capable of growth and follows the movement of evolution. It is not a descent of the involution from above. It is formed progressively around the spark of divine consciousness, which is meant to be the center of a growing being, which becomes the psychic being when it is at last individualized. So she's describing now this phase when the individualization took place in humanity. It is this spark that is permanent and gathers around itself all sorts of elements for the formation of that individuality. The true psychic being is formed only when the psychic personality is fully grown, fully built up around the eternal divine spark. So this we understand now as an evolutionary process. It attains its culmination, its total fulfillment, if and when it unites with a being or personality from above. Now, this is the interesting part. So let's say there has been this development of the soul which has come into its own, individualized, even acquiring a personality, but it's not yet complete until it unites with a being from above. What is the being here? We can say our own higher self. Our own, what Sri Aurobindo calls the central being, the aspect of the self which presides over the journey of your individual psychic development. But at some point, it's as if this joins with that. The psychic joins with the self. But of course, there is ordinarily hardly any individual formation. There is only this presence, more or less. And then, by the growth of the body around the spark of divine consciousness, humanity begins upon the earth. Certain human organisms came in the course of this progressive growth sufficiently perfected. Now, she's describing a time when humanity was growing out of animalhood. Somehow, a certain group within humanity got to this higher visualization and perfection. And by their opening and receptivity, allowed a junction with certain beings descending from above. This gave rise to a kind of divine humanity, which may be called a race of the elite. Now, this is extremely important because it represents an event that took place without which we would not be the human beings that we are today. It has happened not once, it has happened many times, but this particular event was the most significant. And we remember it in India as the Vedic age, when the Vedic rishis, human beings born in a human way, emerging out of humanity, were able to rise to an extraordinary spiritual height until they as if united with an aspect of the divine descending from above. And each of the rishis united to a different aspect of the divine, and as a collective together, they manifested something of the whole possibility of the divine. So when you look at the Vedic verses, the name of the rishi tells you what that aspect represents. And the verses that flow through him are revealing or manifesting that power and that aspect. So the rishi is not merely a seer, he is also now an incarnation, we will say, a vibhuti of an aspect of the divine. But in the process, humanity, through him, in him, is lifted up to what Mother says, what may be called a race of the elite. What happens then? Once you form this elite, spiritual race, what do? You need to protect what is achieved, what is realized. And so, if only they had remained by themselves, these people would have continued as a race, unique and superhuman. You have the stories of the rishis, the kind of power, capacity, knowledge that they held. And the rest of humanity looks up to them, almost hero worships them. Some of them became great kings even. And so the kings were deified, lifted to this supra-humanity almost. And then she continues, indeed, many races have made claims to that, a race unique and superhuman. See, many races have made claim to that. The Aryan, the Semitic, the Japanese have all in turn considered themselves the chosen race. But in fact, there has been a general leveling of humanity, a lot of intermixture. For there arose the necessity of prolongation of the superior race, which drove it to intermix with the rest of humanity, the animal humanity, that is to say. Now you see the very important idea here. If that race was to be prolonged, it had to mix with the rest of humanity. And in the mixing with what was still an animal humanity was the uplifting of the rest of humanity, by which alone this which was created could be prolonged. And so again, we see the importance of this movement of diffusion, which lifts, even though there is a loss, as if. Thus, its value was degraded and led to that great fall which is spoken of in the world's scriptures. The coming out of paradise, the end of the golden age. So in the Abrahamic traditions, it is the fall from paradise. In the Indian tradition, it is the end of the Satya Yuga. Indeed, it was a loss from the point of view of consciousness, but not from that of material strength, since it was a tremendous gain to ordinary humanity. It's a very interesting suggestion in the wording. Loss from the point of view of consciousness. Obviously, this high consciousness is gone. But what is gained? gain of material strength, a tremendous gain to ordinary humanity. Now that has got fixed into matter in humanity, and humanity has now grown as a result in a way that something of that is fixed in matter. The physical tissue of humanity has as if been lifted up. There were certainly some beings who had a very strong will not to mix. They resented losing their superiority. And it is just this that is the real origin of race pride, race exclusiveness, and a special caste distinctions like that cherished by the Brahmins in India. So it's as if some part of this says, no, but I don't want to mix. That impulse to not mix remains as the sense of distinction and superiority, even though the mixture actually takes place and you cannot avoid it. But at present, it cannot be said that there is any portion of mankind which is purely animal. All the races have been touched by the descent from above, and owing to the extensive intermixture, the result of the involution was more widely spread. Of course, one cannot say that every man has got a psychic being, just as one cannot refuse logic. If I don't get it, I refuse to follow. And if at that point you accept the truth of this questioning, you actually draw in the intellect and join it with the experience. You do not need to have this disruptive division. I don't know if I shared this experience here. I was once invited to Bangalore to a school which was connected with Sri Aurobindo, and I had given the topic Science of Indian Rituals. So originally we had planned a 1-hour session with a short question answer. I gave examples of many rituals which are popular and of course to which younger people rebel. And I gave the deeper insight, sometimes very logical, sometimes very practical, sometimes with a symbolic content, sometimes with an occult element. But when understood, suddenly it makes a lot of sense. And so during the question answer, we went on, and the whole thing went on for 2 hours. About 1,000 children. I came back from there. A week later, the principal of the school phoned. Well, you seem to have created a bit of a wave in the school. I said, what happened? Parents are now coming to meet us. I said, oh my God, what did I say which has hurt somebody? And they said, no, the parents are coming to say, earlier we were trying to teach the children. Now the children are teaching us how to do it the right way. What was the change? They understood, the mind accepted, and so they could move forward. And so the question we have to ask is, this tendency will be there, the rebellious and the need to simplify and make it accessible to the superficial life of man. But do we need to lose that Catholicity in the Protestant movement? And that's the theme of the next paragraph, where Sri Aurobindo says, it is possible to actually preserve the truth of both without this disruptive tendency. But before we move to that, since these two terms, Catholic and Protestant, are much more today understood in their more historical and their European context as the two great branches of division in the Christian, let's say, religion. We spoke about it briefly last time. There were a few passages of the Mother speaking about this distinction, which I thought worth reading. They're a little strong, they're somewhat intense, but they help us to understand why this division can be so harmful. Because one of the points Sri Aurobindo makes is in this disruptive Protestant, you're protesting, in the Protestant movement, there is a turn of the intellect to try to remove all that it does not understand. With it, there is a dryness, narrowness, paucity of spiritual life. And when the intellect has sufficiently denied things, it goes on denying until it negates everything, throws out all spirituality, leaving only intellect as the sole surviving power. We read that last time. And of course, intellect void of spirit, it only piles up external knowledge, machinery, efficiency. And the secret springs of spirit dry up. decadence. And if nothing can rejuvenate, you lose it all. So, of this, there are three portions which I wanted to share. Most of them come from the Mother's Agenda. And we see this extreme of what happens when the drying up takes place. And it's important to understand that not only because it has happened so many times in history and sometimes in smaller pockets, but because this drying up has been so important in current humanity, especially in the last 100 years, with the exaggerated materialism that came with it. And the materialism of science itself, which has almost rejected its own higher possibilities. So we will understand that more deeply when we read this. So some Supreme tells the Mother, one wonders how people in Europe can break through that Christian carapace. Carapace is thick skin. It seems extremely solid. It's terrible, really, Supreme says. And Mother replies, oh, indeed it is. Even in America, mon petit, they are in its grip. They're always falling back into their Christianity. It's going to be very hard. Supreme. I don't know why, but every time I come into contact with a Christian thought, it fills me with anger. So Mother's comment, oh, I understand. Because it's true, that an Asura is behind it all, not Christ. It's a very powerful statement, but we will just accept it. She said it, and we'll understand why. Sri Aurobindo considered Christ an avatar, a minor form of avatar, one emanation of the divine aspect of love, he always said. So it's not the full emanation of love, it's one emanation of the divine aspect of love, he always said. But what people have made of him, Mother exclaims. Besides, the religion was founded 200 years after his death. Now, you can imagine at a time when a written word was already not so well known, you didn't have a printed book that it could spread out. It was an oral tradition going on a couple of generations, maybe written, lost, and 200 years at that point makes for a huge, huge shift. So besides, the religion was founded 200 years after his death. And it's nothing but a political construction, a tool for domination, built with the Lord of falsehood in the background, who in his usual fashion took something true and twisted it. Very powerful, but it needs to be faced. You see also the context in which the Roman Empire said, oh, here, let's make this the state religion. But the objectives of empire, which was to control and dominate. So the religion itself was, and whatever surviving living form of Christianity was there among the people, it took that and created a structure to dominate and control the empire. But you see what happened then, and it's part of the continuation of the discussion. When they built it into the empire, it spread through the empire all over Europe as the force of Christianity, even with all the distortions or with the seed of truth behind it. She continues, it's a real hodgepodge, that religion, the number of sects. The only common ground is the divinity of Christ. And it became Asuric when he was made out to be unique. There has been but one incarnation, Christ. That's just where it all went wrong. We'll see, Mother says. It is resisting everywhere. It's even more resistant than materialism. Interesting. So in her work, she's struggling with the resistance of the religious structure, which has got this political form, and on the other side, the resistance of materialism. But this is more resistant than materialism. Interesting. And in another form, she said that science would actually open more easily to the spirit than religion, because in the very core of science is this need to find the truth and to know what's real. Then Supreme. Of course, nothing is more terrible than idealists. They're the worst. They're worse than the bad people. Mother. Oh, if you mean the Puritans, the Protestants, dreadful. They're the worst. Catholicism still retains something of the occult sense. And after all, they have a certain adoration for the Virgin, which keeps them in contact with something that's not Asuric. Very interesting. This aspect of worship of the Virgin Mary, worship of the Divine Mother, ensured that within that larger structure which was created by the church, something of that light and truth was still held. And so, wherever you see within the general Christian denominations or communities, wherever that aspect of the Virgin is strong, you'll find the light of that spiritual intent is quite strong also, which keeps them in contact with something that's not Asuric. The last Pope, who's dead now, Pius XII, had broadened both his own mind and the church doctrine a lot. He was a devotee of the Virgin, Mother says. But the Protestants turned back to the Father. And so their worship became exactly the worship of a one and only personal God, an Asuric God. And they have fabricated and distorted everything, like asceticism, for instance, and all that sort of thing. Everything they touched was twisted and spoilt. And then Mother changes the subject. Now, elsewhere, in a different discussion, she picks up the same idea because Supreme raises this issue several times. That speaking about the Pope, and then Supreme says that I get a sense of revulsion. And then he explains why. He says, under cover of synthesis or broadening of the doctrine, they may very well try to expand the power of Catholicism over the world. Supreme is afraid of this. And Mother's response, of course, but it's obvious. That's their intention. Only there is always an irony in things. And now comes something so brilliant, so astoundingly beautiful that we will allow it to sink in fully. Only there is always an irony in things. If they grow too fast, they'll be engulfed in their own magnitude. It cannot be otherwise. But now she explains something. If out of the need to enlarge, the Pope accepts, for instance, all the different sects, they've already started to accept the Protestants. If he accepts all those sects, Mother laughs, little by little they will either break apart or be drowned. You see, in the very nature of the impulse to expand, it's as if the correction and the freedom is there. But we'll see the full import of this. It's something beautiful. You follow? If we look at it from above, so Mother is seeing from the divine perspective from above, let's even assume it's an Asuric power. It isn't. Mother hesitates. It isn't clearly and distinctly an Asuric power because by his very position, the Pope is obliged to recognize a God higher than himself. So the Pope is not an Asuric power. That God may, of course, be an Asura. But I have a sort of memory, and now Mother narrates this. I have a sort of memory, the memory of a very ancient story no one ever told me, in which the first Asura challenged the Supreme Lord. Now, when Mother says this, she is very humble in her articulation. She says, a memory of a very ancient story no one ever told me. So meaning it's coming from not past lives, but from a poise of consciousness which belongs to the origin of the Divine Mother. Because now she is telling you what happened in a conversation between the first Asura and the Divine. Okay? In which the first Asura challenged the Supreme Lord and told him, I am as great as you. And the answer from the Divine, the answer was, I wish you would become greater than I. Because then there will be no more Asura. You see, it's so beautiful, so profound, so suggestive, and so deep. I reread this. And then she elaborates, but read this. The first Asura challenged the Supreme Lord and told him, I am as great as you. And the answer was, I wish you would become greater than I, because then there will be no more Asura. Because in the very movement of growing to the divine, to become greater of the divine, you immerse in the one. Then Mother says, this memory is very living somewhere, that is in her own poise of Divine Mother. If you become the whole, it's finished. You see? The Asura's ambition is to be greater than the Supreme Lord. Become greater than I, then there will be no more Asura. On a very small scale, it's the same thing on the earth, Mother says. You see the principle she's now pointing on a small scale. In a certain state of consciousness, it becomes absolutely impossible to worry about what may happen. Everything becomes visibly, obviously, the work of one and the same force, one and the same consciousness, one and the same power. So that sense and will and ambition to be more powerful, greater, is again the same force which pushes you to expand to the limitless. As soon as you cross the limit, it's finished. And then she says, these are old ideas. The old ideas of two powers opposing each other, the power of good and the power of evil, and the battle between the two, which of the two will have the last word. There was a time when children were entertained with such stories. They are just children's stories. You see, the way she has shown it to us, you look from above, and the Asura who's rising to challenge the divine is absorbed into the divine in fulfilling himself in his challenge, isn't it? There is no opposition, there is no conflict, there's no battle of good and bad. So they are just children's stories. Some people, or if you like, some beings or forces or consciousness, in order to progress, need to give themselves to merge. And in total self-annihilation, they attain realization. Now you see, some people, in order to progress, need to give themselves to merge. And in total annihilation, they attain realization. For others, the path is diametrically opposite. It's a growth, a domination, an expansion. Prefer this path, others prefer that one. But when we reach the end, it will all meet. There's a very interesting aphorism of Sri Aurobindo. I will paraphrase, where he says that he justifies the position of the Asura, where he says, if I cannot meet God with love, then I would rather challenge him and fight him. It's the same idea, that in the very act of challenging God to grow into his power and his knowledge and his infinity, well, you merge into him. So it's the Asura's way to oppose and by opposing realize. Ultimately, the one thing necessary is to abolish limits. There are many ways to abolish limits, and maybe they are all equally difficult. Silence. And then Mother says, that religion is perhaps the one I have fought the most. Now we're coming back to the topic of the religious groups. That religion is perhaps the one I have fought the most, for a very simple reason. It's power. Its means of action, the power it uses as a means of action, is fear. And of all things, fear is the most degrading. I saw two examples of this, one physically and the other intellectually. And intellectually, it was a studio friend for years. We had done painting together. She was a very gentle girl, older than I. Very serious, very good painter. During the last years of my life in Paris, I saw her often and I spoke to her, first of occult matters, then of what I knew of Sri Aurobindo. I had a group there and I used to explain certain things. And she would listen with great understanding. She understood, she approved. Now one day I went to her house and she told me she was in a great torment. This is a mental thing. When she was awake, she had no doubts. She understood very well. She felt the limitations and obscurities of religion. She came from a family with several archbishops and a cardinal. Well, one of those old French families. But at night, she told me, I suddenly wake up with an anguish, and something from my subconscious obviously tells me, but after all this, what if you go to hell? And she repeated, when I'm awake, it doesn't have any force, but at night, when it comes up from the subconscious, it chokes me. Then, mother says, then I looked and I saw. So, see, she's looking at the force behind, which is coming through the subconscious. Then I looked and I saw a kind of huge octopus over the earth. That formation of the church of hell. You see, the church has created this formation of fear of hell. And that formation of the fear and hell has this form of like a giant octopus over the earth. That feeling is against it. There is at night that octopus of the fear of hell which comes and grips you. That brought home to terrestrial, that is, it's all over the earth, mother says. There are Catholics everywhere, in China, in Africa, among the Negroes, people who don't have a thought to these things, people who don't give a thought to these things, yet are under the sway and caught by the octopus. Now, the people themselves may not be thinking about hell, may not have any obvious worry about the fear, but the grip of the octopus acts. Another time when I was younger, so this I had narrated last time, I was sitting right next to a confessional. One day, as I sat there painting, I saw the priest arrive and enter the confessional. That man, completely black, tall, thin, the very face of wickedness and hardness. He closeted himself in there. After a short while, there came a rather young woman, perhaps 30 years old, gentle, very sweet, not intelligent, but very sweet, entirely dressed in black. She entered the box. He was already shut in and could no longer be seen, and they spoke through a grill. I should add that it's far more medieval than in France. So she was in Italy at that point. It was almost theatrical. She knelt down there. I saw her long gown flowing out, and she was speaking. I couldn't hear what she was whispering. Besides, they spoke in Italian, although I understand Italian. The voices were barely audible. There was no sound. Then all at once, I heard the woman sobbing. She was sobbing in spasms, and it went on till suddenly a collapse. She crumpled in a heap on the floor. So obviously, what he was telling her, the fear of damnation, of hell, etc., that she had to suffer for her whatever guilt and so on. Then that man opened the door, shoving aside her body with the door, and he strode away without a backward glance. I was young, you know, and if I could have, I would have killed him. What he had just done was monstrous. And he was going away. It was a chunk of steel that walked out. Incidents of that sort have left me with a peculiar impression. The stories of the Inquisition had already given me a sufficient, she doesn't say what. Now, of course, you have heard what I told you, the story of the Asura. And that's really my way of seeing the thing. But there was a time when I might have said, no religion has done more evil in this world than this one. But I'm not so sure now. It's one aspect of that religion. The problem is the good and the spiritual, which could help someone grow, is almost inextricably mixed with this aspect. And that's what creates the problem. It's yet too human a vision of things. I prefer, mother says, I prefer the vision of the Lord telling the Asura, go ahead, keep on growing and growing and growing, and there will be no more Asura. Laughing, mother, that's better. And then she speaks about this Paul, the Pope of that time. This man, Paul VI, may have been like that priest in Venice. He was tall, young man, couldn't have been more than 30, very thin with a face like a knife blade. Oh. And then mother says, fear is not a negative thing. It's a very positive thing. It's a special form of power that has always been used by the Asuric forces. It's there. I can see whenever people are defeated, use of it, you'd better beware. Mother turns to the photo, stares at the photo, and so on. We skip this now, the rest of it. So, if you intend to make use of it, you'd better beware. Mother turns to the photo, stares at the photo, and so on. We skip this now, the rest of it. Oh, and one more part. In France, all those who have an awakening, a spiritual need, rush back to the Catholic religion, which means the octopus still has a great deal of power there, a very great deal. And then she says, some time ago, I don't remember on what occasion, I recalled the time when you couldn't say that the earth rotates or even that it's round. They killed you. Can you imagine that? All the same, we have covered a good bit of ground. And so, and then she says, don't record all I've said. I don't want to have it here. I don't want it kept. Because the time hasn't come for me to meddle in these affairs. So we will take it in that spirit. So Satyam again speaks about the octopus and the battle in the thought and all that, and we can skip that. She says, with France's intellectual quality, the quality of her mind, the day she is truly touched spiritually, she never has been. The day she is touched spiritually, it will be something exceptional. Something very interesting. You see, the kind of foresight mother has, and that's why mother wanted that the link from India to Europe for the spiritual knowledge and the teaching of Sri Aurobindo should be through France. Because if that very refined intellect can open, something extraordinary can happen. She says, Sri Aurobindo had a great liking for France. I was born there, certainly for a reason. In my case, I know it very well. It was the need of culture, of a clear and precise mind, of refined thought, taste, and clarity of mind. There is no other country in the world for that. None. Of course, today's France, we may not say the same anymore, but still, it has not lost it either. And Sri Aurobindo had a liking for France for the same reason, a great liking. He used to say that throughout his life in England, he had a much greater liking for France than for England. There is a reason. And then she says, we'll see. So we skip this, and well, there was one more I had put together for the same purpose. That's okay, not necessary. So what we see, what is described here, taking place inside cultures, inside societies, inside nations, inside communities, inside families, and of course within us individually. Not just as a struggle between us, aspects of our spiritual tendency, but also as developmental stages in our evolution. So all that we have read in these last few paragraphs describing this development of religion, we have to understand in all these different aspects. And Sri Aurobindo deliberately points to each of these. He does not develop, otherwise the book would become 10 times bigger, but he points to them and then develops centrally the idea, and then it's for us to apply it to all these different directions that he has pointed to. So now we come to this idea. Would it be possible for us to develop these two needs in a way that they do not disrupt, that they do not contradict and conflict? Is that possible? And so the next paragraph, it would have been possible for the evolutionary principle to have preserved its pristine wholeness of movement while pressing on. By an expansion and not a disruption of the wiser ancient harmony. to a greater synthesis of the principle of concentration and the principle of diffusion. So here comes the problem. In expanding, we have lost. But can you expand without losing? And it's possible. And so he will give the example of what happened in the East and particularly in India, where many different forms developed. Now, why is that important? We will see the same thing here in the spread of the work of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. It takes on many facets, many aspects. But if there is a conscious effort to maintain the living force of experience, all these different aspects will be complementary and even elaborate into a complex, rich, multifaceted revelation of application of knowledge and action. So when there was an effort to form various times different movements for expansion, and all of this was, by the way, after 1956, after the supramental manifestation took place, Mother said now the expansion can take place because the base had been, so to say, set. So Sri Aurobindo Society was one of those vehicles. And the guideline Mother gave, the motto itself she gave was propagation but not propaganda. And then the motto she gave, to know is good, to be is better, to live that is perfect. That's it. To know is good, to do is better, to be that is. It evokes something. You start doing it, but when you're doing, I do, there's already a gap. And in the doing, after a while, all that we discussed earlier will start. The doing, after a while, will lose the force of the living experience, and after a while, it becomes an empty form, and so on. So you will see the same pattern in the Catholic and the Protestant manner. One holds this and the other applies it much more to life on a practical domain, and so tends to lose this, but they are still complementary. I remember my first experience of the difference between the two. We were it was a gathering of religious leaders, and it happened several times that the person who represented the Protestant community, he would behave in a peculiar way. And I would say, why is this fellow wasting time talking about all these things which have nothing to do with the spiritual? And then we were in Egypt, and in the Coptic community, we were trying to understand the Coptic teaching and their belief, and it was fascinating because they still hold the original, something of the original lineage of the Pharaohic tradition mixed with the Christian tradition. And it's as if many elements of the Christian tradition go back to the Pharaohic tradition, including the symbol of the baby carried by the mother, or and so on. So, and they hold that still. And this person began to ask, so what do you do about justice for people? What are you doing for the well-being of economy, society, and so on? And I asked my neighbor, why is he talking about all this? We are here to learn about their teaching. This has nothing to do with their teaching. And then she explained to me, she said, because the Protestants are always concerned with what's good for society and for justice in society. That's their focus, not the spiritual aspect. And so suddenly something clicked. It's the application of the spiritual ideal, but in the process, the ideal is forgotten. The application becomes more important. And so the necessity of this synthesis, it cannot happen as long as you are doing. You go out to do, you go out to preach, you go out to apply what you have learned. And so comes the third level of integration, where to live, to be that is perfect. So to know is good, to do is better, to be that is perfect. When you are, the action flows from you spontaneously. There is not I who knows doing an action which does not know. It flows because I am. And so I give you these two messages and mottos that the mother gave to the Sri Aurobindo Society, because precisely their intention was as if to take this to a wider audience. In the formation of the ashram itself, you will see the same idea. Mother infusing the spiritual principles into every possible activity of life. every possible without exception, including businesses, by the way. So when some of the disciples, devotees came and said, "Oh, we want to start a little business," Mother said, "Great." She blessed it. And the name she gave to the business, Honesty. And then the second one was opened. It was a different kind of business, departmental store. One was an electrical, the second was departmental store. Mother gave the name Honesty. And then there was engineering section. Mother gave the name Honesty. Now you will say, where is the imagination? You should have different names, isn't it? But it was her way of fixing these values into business. Where unfortunately, for a very long time, business was associated with dishonesty or with taking advantage of another in some way in order for you to profit. But the true business, the true Vaishya Dharma is when everybody grows and you create value that benefits all and nobody loses. And for that, the first foundation is honesty. And honesty not just with the other, with your client, with your employees, but with yourself. And by putting it right there in the very heading of the business, well, every day that was hammered into the activity. And remember what we read earlier, it is the formula is tested, it is applied, and then it is disseminated. So the dissemination's result you see today, because the whole culture of business has changed. Business which was not based on transparency and honesty today does not survive. Even if they seem to have grown big, they suddenly collapse because they're hollow inside. The ones which survive are those which have built themselves on these deeper principles. But I took that as an example. Every activity of life was represented in the ashram community. And so there was a possibility of this concentration slowly or in their own houses, in their lives, people applying those values. And then a little more, and then a little more. Propagation, but not propaganda. What's the difference? You propagate, and then a little more, and then a little more. Propagation, but not propaganda. What's the difference? You propagate what is lived. In propaganda, you talk about what needs to be done, but it's not lived. So when you transmit by living experience, there is a propagation. I remember meeting somebody, and I won't take the name of it's a new age group in the United States, very famous at one point, and a very charismatic leader. And one of the right-hand persons of the leader broke away from that group. He had come here, by the way, he had seen things, wrote about the ashram in their journal, and then one day we heard he just broke away. And after he broke away, I met him, and I asked him what happened. He said, well, we didn't see eye to eye with the leader on many things. Because for me, what we are preaching, we should be living. So obviously he saw that gap in their leader. And then as we were talking, he said, I've been to so many communities. Because he was editor of the journal, he had been all over. But I've seen something very special among all the devotees of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. There is a certain authenticity, there is a genuineness, there is don't know what word he used, but something which indicated, I'll use the word sincerity, which is the closest, as I remember, of the sense, the meaning of the words, which he said, I don't find in other movements. And there's one big reason why. Because inherent to this, there is no movement, there's no attempt to preach, there's no attempt to spread. People come, and if they're touched by something, well, they begin to put into practice, and that's what happens. And in the centers, this was the guideline Mother gave. You make available Sri Aurobindo's teaching. Those who are touched by it come and draw from what they can. That's all you do. You do not go out to preach. And to the extent that this was kept, you see this sincerity and authenticity in those who follow Sri Aurobindo. And the fact that he noted it, and he said this as the only group where he has seen it, I thought that was significant. In any group where there is an effort to reach out, increase your numbers, bring more followers, bring more memberships, raise more money, you have to put up an appearance in order to be able to expand rapidly. And in that act, you have already lost this principle of concentration and the living force of it. So, It would have been possible for the evolutionary principle to have preserved its pristine wholeness of movement while pressing on by an expansion and not a disruption of the wiser ancient harmony. The harmony built can expand without disrupting to a greater synthesis of the principle of concentration and the principle of diffusion. And then he says, in India, we have seen there has been a persistence of the original intuition and the total movement of evolutionary nature. So, that initial movement which we saw in the early stage of religion, that has never broken away. It has never gone through this radical change, suddenly getting intellectualized, suddenly getting dissipated, suddenly breaking into reaction, Protestant form to a Catholic form, and so on. That original stream continues, but in the process, it branches out innumerably. And what is the nature of that branching out and what it does in the specialized branches? What are the limitations or difficulties that come with this very rich branching out that we will see in the subsequent text on next Sunday? For now, we can pause and concentrate on, assimilate the various insights that we went through, beginning with the sense of the role of the darshan and the double movement during the darshan, as well as introspect within ourselves of all these tendencies which we have described, and what we can do to bring a deeper harmony within us, and what we can do to extend the influence of our own higher aspiration into our community, or at least the immediate environment, to build a more stable base of society, which is a necessity, the mother said.